Hello there, I'm Jonathan Rowson, and I've been asked to give some thoughts on in what way the climate crisis is a spiritual issue. And I have too much to say about this really for one video. I've been thinking about it in one way or the other for quite a long time now. Around about 10 years ago, I started thinking about why people were so icky and uncomfortable speaking about spiritual matters in public policy contexts. I was working at the Royal Society of Arts in London at the time. And I began a project on spirituality, trying to make sense of how to speak of it more clearly, give it a bit more intellectual rigor, but keep it in connection with its sort of religious traditions, but equally not necessarily limit it to that, and find a way of sort of putting spirituality to work in some meaningful sense without instrumentalizing it and denaturing it. And around the same time, I was working on rethinking the climate change conundrum. Because for me, it was always very obvious that this wasn't a simple environmental issue or a green issue. In fact, I always thought it was a kind of conceptual catastrophe that people equated the climate crisis with any other environmental issue. It's much deeper and broader and fuller than that. And why? Because when you really contend with what climate change is about, it's about the underlying logic of civilization. And not just logic, but also sensibility and disposition. It's about the kind of movements at scale of cultures and economic logics and political modalities that lead to one way of life prevailing over time. And when you consider that about half of global emissions have come after 1990, it really helps to focus the mind. This is, in one way, a deep-rooted problem historically. In another way, it's a very contemporary problem and very much to do with industrial capitalism of a certain kind, principally in the last 30 years or so, but going back 60 or maybe even longer. I mean, you can go back to the Industrial Revolution, but that's sometimes missing the point. Anyway, the point is that it's a way of living at scale now for approaching 8 billion people. So when you ask in what way is it a spiritual issue, you think, surely not. Surely it's an economic and political matter. Surely it's about global cooperation. Surely it's about the energy supply. Surely it's about green finance. And yes, it's all of that. And, no one says stop doing that. But when you consider that we've been talking about this and not getting nowhere, some progress has been made, but far too slowly and not nearly at sufficient scale. And not nearly with the requisite determination and clarity. When you think of that, you start to think about human beings as being rather stuck. And not just human beings, because we do have our own existential stuckness. We get stuck in our ways and caught up in our habits, and we can't shake out of our identity that we constructed back in our early 20s sometimes, and we live that for the rest of our days. I'm speaking more about societal stuckness, about social imaginaries, and political logics that keep us trapped in a way of living. For example, democracy now is very closely tied to the idea of mandate. Mandate is very closely tied to economic growth and delivering higher living standards, right? That's what I mean by stuckness. So when you think about stuckness at scale, that's where the spiritual matter comes in, because becoming unstuck is the language of revelation and epiphany and spiritual practice and growth, and the role of community in supporting and fostering that growth, and revelation and insight and these kind of language forms become very powerful and salient. Because if we're going to have a chance of significantly improving the climactic projections and keeping the planet within a sort of habitable set of ecological conditions, we're going to have to get unstuck at scale. And what does that mean? It means a kind of transformation at scale, an economic, political, and cultural transformation. Now, you can't get that with a click of the fingers. That doesn't happen because you wish for it to be so. Nor will you get it through progressive imperialism, through wishing everyone was good and nice and shared the same eco-sensibility. No, it will be a much deeper and darker reckoning. And that's why the spiritual matters come into play. For instance, there's questions of love. Questions of what does it mean to love the planet, to love the conditions of conscious life that the planet gives us. to rediscover that love. Because love, of course, is no fluffy pink thing that we like to add on to our emotions. Love is, as a sort of primordial force, the ultimate reality, contends with matters of power, and it's supposed to. I mean, that goes back to Paul Tillich and Martin Luther King and all the rest of it. The relationship between love and power is right at the heart of the climate conundrum. As is death, because we deny our own deaths. We know we're going to die intellectually, but don't live every day as though we feel it emotionally. Likewise, climate collapse. We really might be stupid enough to destroy our only home. As I put it in an essay I wrote recently called Tasting the Pickle, are we really condemned to be the idiots who blame the bastards for the world falling apart? Because it looks a lot like we might be. In those last 30 years, when half of the emissions have happened, we've been talking about this. You know, The Inconvenient Truth by Al Gore, Greta Thunberg, Extinction Rebellion. Yes, there are, the New York climate marches. There are moments of global awakening, but they're not happening quickly enough and at sufficient scale. We need more unsticking, more revelation, more epiphany, more resolute waking up. And to get there, we have to contend with love and death, but also with self. Who are we, right? In response to this conundrum, each individual cannot possibly fathom, let alone respond to, a global collective action problem caused directly or indirectly by almost 8 billion people. Now, I know that's primarily a certain number of companies, and it's predominant in the global north, of course. It has a political dimension. Nonetheless, each individual, the scale between their scope for agency and action and the problem writ large has a huge gap. There's a massive dissonance there, and a kind of unconquerable conundrum in which we feel we ought to do something, and yet our own sense of what it means to do something and the scale of the problem we're contending with, they don't speak the same language, it feels like. So we have to find a way of reimagining identity that is at once more collective and global, and yet is not disconnected from our own sense of agency and purpose in the world as we find it, in our homes, in our streets, in our communities, our schools, our businesses, and so forth. So love, death, and self, but also soul, because the climate crisis is darkly beautiful. It's horrific in one way, really tragic, that human beings might be deluded and feckless and disorganized and wayward enough not to be able to get their act together to preserve their only habitable habitat, as far as we know. We really might be that craven, and not each individual, but systemically as a species. And then it's like, what responsibility do you take towards that? But before you get to the responsibility, there's the soul feeling of being in this historical moment, because not everyone has this kind of awareness. We have this collective awareness that each of us is called upon to act in a certain way. But the nature of the action won't be a new renewable or energy efficient light bulb, nor will it be necessarily investment in green technology or putting a solar panel on your new home, or these things may play a small part, but our only real hope is not that kind of relatively low-hanging fruit. Our only real hope is something more like, through the soul's encounter with this historical moment and the relationship of love and power that we're called upon to contend with, that we find our unique contribution somehow, such that we find a way to live fully and deeply and joyously, but nonetheless face up to this challenge that is a species-level event of singular proportions that we cannot possibly deal with directly in the way that we deal with our breakfast or our job, but we nonetheless have to somehow look it in the eye and feel that we're doing what we're called upon to do as a human being. So love, death, self, and soul as the kind of parameters of becoming, by which we become unstuck. That's the sense in which I see the climate conundrum as being a spiritual problem. There's much more to say, but that's hopefully enough to get started, and I'd be very happy to talk about it further as and when time allows. Thanks very much.